Hi, welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. So often I hear people that even come to work with me, but people generally as well, talk about how they've healed something or how they've dealt with something, often related to trauma or really any type of wounding. Yet they find that they continue to struggle with things, and then they blame themselves, they feel ashamed because they thought they worked through that already. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some signs that maybe there is some deeper healing to do, things that you might notice. I also want to be very clear that there is no shame in having done work to heal and find that you still struggle. Because as you've heard me talk about, healing is a process and a practice. It's not something that you just learn, implement, and suddenly you're healed. It doesn't work that way. So whether you've done a little bit of healing or a lot of healing, especially if you've not actually dealt with the real issues, like done the reprogramming necessary to change what you believe about who you are, those struggles are going to pop back up. So don't be ashamed of that. There's nothing to be ashamed of, and don't feel bad about that. It doesn't say anything about who you are or what you're capable of. It just means that you haven't done the deeper work of healing what that core wounding is. That's it. So, what are some signs that maybe there's a little bit more healing to do? Well, one is that you notice in a variety of circumstances that you struggle with doubting yourself. How you doubt yourself might look quite different depending on the circumstance, or really even the day, depending on how everything else is going. So with self-doubt, it can be something that's seemingly relatively minor, like, oh, I don't know if I can do this, but you do it. But that idea, that sense of, oh, can I do this? I don't know if I can do this. If that comes up continually, there's a sign that maybe there's some work to do. Like, why is that your default? If you can actually push through that doubt and do it anyway, then there is some healing that's happened. There is something that has shifted within you, or maybe it's even part of the way that you cope, but allows you to do that. And so that is good. And a lot of people will look at that and say, okay, that means that I've healed because I'm making the choice to do this. But you know, if you struggle with self-doubt, that it doesn't feel good. Doubting yourself, especially pretty regularly, really can weigh on you. It can create lots of problems within how you show up in the world and in relationships. Self-doubt can also show up in kind of more significant ways where you remove yourself or refuse to go into situations. And when I say refuse, there's different ways that can look. But you don't put yourself in situations that you don't feel 100% confident in. I can definitely relate to this one. I had the other kind of self-doubt too, but this kind of self-doubt is something that was definitely a big factor for me. If I didn't feel like I could do it perfectly, then I wasn't going to do it. And let's be real, of course I never did anything perfectly, but the idea, which obviously means that I didn't do a lot of the things that I really wanted to do, but nothing is perfect. But we have this idea that, well, if I don't get it all right, then I shouldn't do it yet. Maybe there's more I need to learn. There's more practice. There's more steps that I need before I can get to that place. So I'm just going to hold off on doing that. You can hold yourself back in doing or expressing even, because what if you're wrong? What if somebody disagrees with you? What if you upset somebody else? And a lot of this can be related to perfectionism, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a moment, but recognizing that self-doubt can play out in many ways. And if it is something that continues to show up, where you doubt your ability, you doubt whether you're enough, you see yourself as a failure often because it wasn't perfect. If that's a continual pattern that shows up, that's a good sign that maybe there's some deeper healing to do. And when I talk about deeper healing, it's often related to being able to really get to the core wounding. And I've talked about this in videos around layers of healing and affirmations and stuff like that. But so much of the work that we do, self-help books and coaching, and sometimes even therapy, focuses more on symptoms than it does the core wounding. And part of that is because there's not, the idea of healing core wounding is not something that's really widely understood, generally speaking. Even particularly outside of the mental health field, but even inside the mental health field, oftentimes it's about symptom management, particularly when it comes to trauma. So again, it's not your fault. It's that the core wounding hasn't been worked through yet. And I see this happen so often with my clients, both when I was in private practice and in the work that I do now, that I've worked with so many people who have been to therapy and done some really helpful work and helped them in a variety of ways. But over time, they keep coming back to the same issues. And these are some of the issues that I'm talking about today. I'm talking about them from experience because they creep back in. And then, of course, they doubt themselves and they feel like somehow they've failed or they're never going to be able to really heal. Nothing's ever going to be able to change. But that's not the case. It's just that the wound has not yet been healed, the actual core wounding. So, self-doubt. Another way that unhealed wounding continues to show up in someone's life is unhealthy and or unfulfilling relationships. So there's a variety of reasons why a relationship may feel unfulfilling. But if you have a pattern of this, that whether it's with an intimate partner or a friendship or co-working relationships, whatever it may be, if you find that you have this kind of pattern of being in unhealthy relationships where maybe even boundaries aren't respected, so it doesn't have to be abusive necessarily, but just not very healthy, or feeling really unfulfilled in your relationships, I think that's helpful to pay attention to and not blame yourself, because that's what we tend to do. But okay, maybe there's something here that would be helpful to look at a little bit more closely. Because one of the reasons that shows up over and over again is that whether it's around boundaries, and people that have wounding that hasn't yet healed almost always struggle with boundaries, or choosing relationships, not consciously choosing, but choosing relationships that in some ways reinforce those core beliefs. So you tend to feel unfulfilled. Or another thing that can happen, and I did this myself, is there might be somebody that you enjoy being around, again, intimate partner or friend, and it's really great. But if you're not used to being in really healthy relationships, it can actually feel kind of uneasy. And you might find yourself pulling back from it or doing things that might cause that other person to want to pull back. And that's part of self-sabotaging, which is another thing that I'm going to talk a little bit about. So if you notice that pattern, don't beat yourself up. There's nothing to be ashamed of, but it is something to pay attention to and think, okay, what's going on here? Even if you've done a lot of great work in healing, because there's something about that that causes you to continue to be drawn to and or stay in those types of situations. And I will also say, particularly when I was in my private practice, that the majority of people that I saw, even those that were not trauma survivors, but especially for trauma survivors, the majority of people that came in to see me when they recognized some sort of pattern with a relationship. So recognizing that they keep choosing to be in relationships with people that don't treat them well or doesn't feel right, somehow it's unhealthy. Or feeling like if they didn't do something to change who they were, then that person might leave them. And that is actually what started my journey of healing. I thought my husband deserved somebody better. So unhealthy or unfulfilling relationships. So the other aspect, and I mentioned this briefly before, is the idea of things being perfect. And that can look different as well for different people or different circumstances. So perfection, the idea of perfection, really is about control and a fear of basically failure, or that if it's not perfect, it will then reinforce those core beliefs of not being good enough, not being deserving, not being worthy. So perfection can be a good indicator. And again, perfection can sometimes look like a good thing. Because maybe you strive really hard, maybe you obsess about things until they are seemingly perfect, maybe you work all kinds of hours to get things done. So on the outside, it can look like it's a really good thing. But what would happen if it didn't get done? What would happen if it wasn't perfect? How does that feel? If it doesn't feel okay, then that's not a good thing. Because again, perfection doesn't really exist. Even something you work really hard on and you feel good about putting out there, there's likely going to be something that isn't perfect about it. And I'm settling into this right now as I'm ready to launch my new program. There are going to be things that aren't perfect, but how does it feel internally? Does it feel fearful? Do you feel ashamed if it's not perfect? Do you feel judged? Are you judging yourself? Or do you feel a sense of groundedness that, okay, it's not perfect, but that's okay? Perfection is often also about control. You're trying to control how you end up feeling. And people often look at control as kind of like you're trying to control people, and that's a bad thing, like you're controlling other people's behavior. And that can certainly be the case, but so often for the people that I know, control isn't really about trying to control other people. It's about trying to control circumstances so you can feel safe in how you're going to feel, so you can be prepared in how you're going to feel or react. So for those who have had control issues, and I am one of them, I've gotten better. It isn't about controlling other people. It really is about trying to control how you feel internally. So that's just a little bit of an aside there. But if you've got control issues, that's also another sign. So the idea that things need to be perfect, it's more about how does it feel inside? Does it stress you out? Do you feel like you failed? Do you not want to show your face if it's not perfect? Those are some signs that there's some deeper healing to do. I'm just looking at my notes here. Another thing is not having an idea of something that you'd like to do, but not following through on it. Or sometimes doing things that you know probably aren't in your best interest, but you can either talk yourself into why you should do it, or almost as a form of resistance, you do it anyway. You don't listen to that voice that says, oh, I don't know if this is a good idea. Ultimately, either one of those is a form of self-sabotage. And self-sabotage, there's a broad spectrum of behaviors that can go into self-sabotaging types of things. And some of that can be things we've already talked about, like maybe holding yourself back in some way, self-doubt. So you don't do the thing that you think that you want to do. You don't try the thing you want to try. But if there is a pattern of you have an idea about something, but you don't follow through on it because of that self-doubt or because of the perfection, whatever it might be, so you don't do it. There are things that you think would be enjoyable. There are things that you think might be good for you. Therapy is one of the things that comes up quite often. So you come up with all the reasons why it's not the right time, it's not going to work, and so you don't do it. That, in a way, is a form of self-sabotage. So that's an example of like not doing something. There are also ways that we do things that are or can be self-sabotaging, like maybe your intuition is telling you that this person that you're interested in, maybe there's some things there that you're not quite sure about, but you dismiss that because you don't want to seem rude, or you feel like you're not worthy of being with somebody that is less arrogant or whatever. Then you do it anyway. You're not trusting that voice. You do things or cope in ways that you know leave you feeling worse afterwards. Again, nothing to be ashamed of here. This is unfortunately natural. It's what we do until we're able to heal. But we do that thing that reinforces that we're unworthy or undeserving. It reinforces the shame that we feel. For example, like with coping, using a substance, for example, without being really addicted, but just using that as a way of not having to feel or deal with something. So not including addiction, because that's a little bit different. But you're struggling, and you know that maybe the best thing to do for you would be to reach out to a friend and just connect without even having to share a whole lot. But you know that reaching out, your therapist has said, is good. That's ideally what you do when you're struggling, instead of isolating or doing things that you know you're not going to feel great about later. But, and again, this is natural, so nothing to feel bad about. Instead, because that feels kind of foreign, there's a part of you that doesn't really think that you are worthy of it, or are really capable of being able to really change how you cope. You end up falling back on that coping mechanism of using some sort of substance or some form of distraction that is not really healthy or good for you. But you do that because that's what you're used to doing, and that is kind of your default. So it's very easy to fall back into that. But then you feel bad. You feel ashamed. You might even physically not feel good. You might not be able to go into work the next day. Potentially, you could end up losing your job. So that becomes self-sabotaging because you end up feeling bad about yourself, and potentially even worse than that. But you end up feeling worse about yourself. You end up reinforcing those beliefs. You often end up feeling shame. So wherever that self-sabotage behavior may land, so it can be kind of extreme, like potentially you end up losing a job or a relationship, or you just keep yourself from having or creating the life that you want, the kinds of relationships that you want. Any type of pattern of self-sabotage is a sign that there's more healing to do. And again, doesn't mean the work that you've done hasn't been valuable. Certainly doesn't mean it's a waste of time. Doesn't mean even that you were focusing on the wrong things, because the person who is guiding you on that is the person that is supposed to be able to help you understand what it is that really needs healing. So especially if you've been to coaching or therapy and not recognized what that deeper wound is, that's not your fault. And I'm not even going to blame it on those other people. So it's not about blame. It's just about a recognition within yourself that maybe there are some other things there that need healing. And again, please do not feel bad about that. It just means that now that you have this awareness, instead of feeling ashamed, instead of feeling incapable of changing that, of being able to heal that, you can begin to do the work of understanding and healing that deeper wound. So I hope that that helps. Thank you for joining me. I will look forward to seeing you next time.